When 20 doctors gave up, a silent housekeeper stepped forward, and everything changed. Richard Harlow was a man who seemed to have everything. At 68, he was the kind of figure whispered about in boardrooms and splashed across the front pages of financial magazines. His empire stretched across continents: shipping, technology, finance. Every industry bore his fingerprints. To his rivals, he was untouchable. To his employees, he was a storm to be feared. And to the world, he was the very picture of power. On this particular afternoon, his mansion glittered in the sunlight, its marble walls reflecting gold as though the heavens themselves admire his wealth. Towering glass windows let the rays pour inside, illuminating the crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen fireworks. Every surface gleamed: polished mahogany tables, imported rugs, priceless art lining the halls. Yet beneath all the luxury, there was a silence and emptiness that the sunlight could not warm. Richard stood near one of those windows, his tall frame stiff in a navy-tailored suit. The silver in his hair caught the light like strands of steel. His sharp blue eyes scanned the grounds, watching the gardeners at work far below, trimming hedges into perfect shapes. His lips pressed into a thin line, not with satisfaction, with a kind of restless irritation. To those who worked under his roof, Richard was a presence felt before he was seen. His footsteps echoed with authority, and his voice carried the weight of command. He had no patience for small talk, no tolerance for mistakes. That afternoon, when a maid quietly slipped into the room to dust the corners, Richard waved her away without turning his head. Later, he muttered, as if her presence polluted the perfection of his space, he believed kindness was weakness. Efficiency was all that mattered. Even gratitude, in his eyes, was unnecessary. After all, he paid his staff well. What more could they possibly need? Despite his wealth, Richard was profoundly alone. His children visited only when business demanded it, their eyes already trained on the inheritance they would one day claim. Friends were long gone, if he had ever truly had them. What surrounded him now was not companionship, but service. Not love, but obligation. The mansion itself reflected him perfectly, breathtaking, commanding, yet cold. Every room designed to impress, but none designed to comfort. Even the grand dining hall, with its endless table and golden candelabras, had not hosted laughter in years. Meals were taken alone, sometimes in silence, sometimes with the hum of news channels reporting. His own name, Richard Harlow, had built a world where he could buy anything: art, influence, even loyalty. But he could not buy the one thing that eluded him: warmth. That invisible quality that turned a house into a home, and a life into something more than numbers. He told himself he didn't need it. He had convinced himself for decades that money was enough. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors, the mansion seemed to whisper the truth he would not admit. All the gold in the world could not fill the silence echoing through its halls. The following day began like any other, sharp, calculated, and meticulously controlled. Richard Harlow never allowed his empire to slow, not even for a moment. His boardroom, perched inside the east wing of his mansion, glowed with sunlight streaming through its tall glass windows. The polished mahogany table stretched like a runway, lined with executives in dark suits. Charts, projections, and strategies filled the air like weapons readied for battle. Richard sat at the head, a commander surveying his army. His voice was sharp, decisive. Cut the losses. Double the investment in Asia, and if they resist, buy them out. His blue eyes narrowed, piercing through every man and woman at the table. To defy him was unthinkable. He was wealth, he was power, and he was permanence. At least that's what everyone believed. But in an instant, permanence shattered. Richard's hand froze mid-gesture, the pen slipping from his fingers. A sudden tightness seized his chest, sharp and merciless. His posture stiffened, his breath caught like a man drowning on dry land. For a second, he tried to fight it, his pride refusing to surrender even to his own body. But then, without warning, his knees buckled. The billionaire who commanded nations collapsed onto the gleaming table with a dull, shocking thud. Papers scattered like frightened birds. A glass of water tipped, spilling across contracts worth billions. His assistants gasped in unison. Silence of authority breaking into chaos. "Mr. Harlow." One shouted, rushing to his side. Another screamed for help, her voice echoing down the marble halls. Phones rang, orders barked, and the pristine calm of the mansion dissolved into a storm of panic. Within minutes, emergency teams swarmed the estate. Sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood surrounding the mansion, their wails announcing that even the mighty could fall. Richard was lifted onto a stretcher, his once commanding body now limp, his face ashen, sweat glistening on his brow. And then began the procession of doctors, men and women flown in from every corner of the globe. 20 of the best, the elite of their fields. Cardiologists, neurologists, specialists in conditions so rare that few even had names. If science could save him, these were the people who would. The mansion transformed into something between a palace and a hospital. Hallways echoed with hurried footsteps, voices thick with medical jargon, the rhythmic beeping of machines. Tubes snaked into Richard's arms, needles pierced his skin, monitors tracked every flicker of his heart. His chest rose and fell in shallow defiance, as if his very body struggled against the fate tightening its grip. "Administer epinephrine. His pulse is unstable. Prepare the defibrillator now." Commands ricocheted through the room. Sparks flew, his body jolting under electric currents, yet his condition remained unchanged. The brightest minds exchanged grim looks, their confidence eroding with every failed attempt. Richard Harlow, who had bought everything life could offer, was now facing something money could not control. His empire could bend markets, his signature could reshape industries, but none of it mattered as the monitors continued their merciless rhythm, each beep slower than the last. The mansion, once a fortress of arrogance, had become a battlefield, where wealth, power, and medicine waged war against mortality. And as the hours passed, it became clear, even with 20 doctors surrounding him, Richard Harlow's body was losing. The mansion no longer felt like a home. It had become a fortress under siege, its glittering chandeliers casting harsh light over a scene of desperation. Richard Harlow lay in the center of his bedroom, a man once untouchable now tethered to wires and machines. The steady hum of medical equipment filled the air, punctuated by sharp alarms that rose and fell like cries of warning. Around him, the doctors worked with relentless urgency. They spoke in clipped tones, their voices overlapping like a symphony of controlled panic. His pressures crashing. "Stabilize him. Get the oxygen up. Push another dose. We're losing him." Again, every command was met with swift hands, needles piercing veins, clear tubes delivering lifelines of liquid hope, machines calibrated and recalibrated. Richard's body twitched under shocks, his chest rising only because the machines forced it to. His face, once proud and cold, looked strangely fragile now. The sharp lines of his jaw sagged, his lips pale, his eyes closed tight as though he were trapped in a dream he could not wake from. Sweat dampened his silver hair, and for the first time in his long commanding life, he looked small. Assistants hovered by the door, their once confident faces etched with terror. They whispered among themselves, voices trembling. This was a man who could crush corporations with a single signature, who commanded armies of lawyers, bankers, and politicians, yet here before them, he was as helpless as a child. The hours dragged on. The sun dipped lower in the sky, staining the windows with gold before giving way to shadows. The doctors did not leave. They refused to concede defeat. Charts were scribbled, new strategies attempted, advanced treatments tried in rapid succession. But each effort ended the same: failure. Neurologist shook his head, his body isn't responding. It's as if he's refusing to fight. A silence followed those words, heavy and suffocating. No one dared to answer, because deep down they knew it was true. Richard had built his life on control, on dominance, on bending the world to his will. But when it came to this, his own failing flesh, he had no weapons left out by evening. Exhaustion hung over the room. Doctors exchanged glances that betrayed their fear. The 20 greatest medical minds in the world stood in the same place, united by one truth. Despite their brilliance, they were powerless. Richard's breathing grew shallow, the machine straining to keep rhythm. The once mighty billionaire, whose empire touched every corner of the globe, now lay suspended between life and death. His wealth lined the walls of his mansion, paintings, gold fixtures, marble floors, but none of it could buy him a heartbeat. And still, they pressed on. More injections, more shocks, more desperate commands, because no one wanted to say the words that hovered like a storm over the room: "We can't save him." Night settled heavily over the mansion, but there was no peace within its walls. The corridors echoed with hushed voices, not of comfort, but of calculation. Behind the heavy double doors of the sitting room, Richard Harlow's family gathered, not to pray for his recovery, but to argue over what would remain once he was gone. His eldest son, Gregory, tall and sharp-faced like his father, paced the room with impatience. "The company will need a steady hand. I've been preparing for this for years. It should naturally fall to me." Across from him, his sister Victoria, draped in designer silk and diamonds that glittered even in the dim light, scoffed. "Naturally? Don't be ridiculous. Father trusted me with the art foundation, with the estate. I've proven myself. The empire should be split." Their voices rose, cutting through the quiet like knives. The younger relatives, nieces and nephews who barely knew Richard beyond his wealth, chimed in, their demands blunt, their greed unashamed. "Does anyone know what's in the will? Have the lawyers been called? If he doesn't make it through the night, I want clarity." Not one spoke of Richard as a man. Not one shed a tear, or whispered a prayer, or begged for his life to continue. Their words circled only around ownership, around money, around power. Meanwhile, only a wall away, Richard lay motionless on his bed. The hiss of oxygen filled the silence of his room, machines blinking steadily beside him. If he could hear the voices of his family, if he could sense their greed, perhaps he would have felt the final sting of betrayal. For all his life, he had believed control was everything, yet in his final hours, he had none. The mansion itself seemed to respond to this atmosphere of despair. Its grand chandeliers, once radiant, now looked cold and harsh. The marble floors that gleamed under daylight now reflected shadows that seemed longer, heavier. Even the air felt different, as though the house itself mourned, not for Richard, but for the love that was absent. The staff tiptoed through the hallways, eyes lowered, afraid to cross the storm of arguments breaking out behind doors. They had served him loyally, some for decades, yet none of them were invited into the family circle. They watched quietly as the people closest to him transformed the house of luxury into a stage of selfishness. Doctors continued their work upstairs, their whispers growing dimmer, their confidence fading. They exchanged glances filled with dread, aware that their science was failing. And still, the family below sharpened their words, already dividing an inheritance not yet theirs. Richard Harlow, once feared, once envied, once untouchable, now lay as a prisoner in his own body, his empire being carved apart in anticipation of his death. The warmth of human connection, of compassion, of genuine care, was absent. In its place remained only greed, fear, and the stench of inevitability. Mansion, which had been built to symbolize power, now seemed colder than a tomb. While the house echoed with greed and quarrels, a quiet presence lingered in the background, someone almost invisible to the family, yet more constant than any of them. Her name was Clara Williams, the housekeeper who had served the Harlow estate. For over 20 years, she moved silently through the mansion, her dark skin contrasting against the polished white marble, her uniform plain against the shimmer of chandeliers. To the heirs bickering over wealth, Clara was just another servant, a shadow in their grand world. But to Richard, though he never admitted it aloud, she had been the one steady presence in a life crowded by sycophants and opportunists. That evening, as the family's voices thundered through the walls, Clara stood just outside Richard's room, a folded towel in her hands. She listened, not out of intent to eavesdrop, but because their arguments were impossible to ignore. Each word was a dagger, and though none were meant for her, Clara felt them deeply. Her heart ached. She remembered the countless times she had seen Richard alone, staring out the tall windows at dusk. A man surrounded by gold, yet starved of warmth. She had dusted his trophies, polished his awards, and seen how quickly they became nothing more than lifeless ornaments. She had set his table when he ate in silence, watched him dismiss kindness with a wave of his hand. But she also saw the loneliness behind his arrogance, a loneliness no amount of money could disguise. Now, lying helpless, he had no one. Not really. The doctors worked with precision, but their voices were clinical, detached. His family waited like vultures for the inevitable. And Clara, though she was only a housekeeper, was the only one who looked at him and saw a man, not a fortune. She stepped inside quietly, her presence barely noticed by the doctors hunched over their monitors. She placed the towel down, then paused. For a moment she just stood there, her dark eyes fixed on Richard's pale face. He looked so fragile, so unlike the man who once walked the halls with authority that made even seasoned businessmen tremble. His lips parted as though trying to form words that never came. Clara's throat tightened. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "You don't deserve to go like this, Mr. Harlow. Not alone. Not unloved." The machines beeped steadily, indifferent to her words. The doctors barely glanced her way. But Clara lingered, her hands clasped in front of her apron. She felt a pull, something deeper than duty, something human, something maternal. It was not about her job. It was about compassion, about the simple truth that every soul, even the most arrogant, deserved a touch of kindness at the end. Outside, the family continued their battle over his empire. Inside, Clara remained still, a silent guardian in the cold room. Though no one asked her to, though no one would thank her, she chose to stay by his side. And in that moment, the mansion's endless wealth and grandeur faded into the background. All that remained was a fragile man on the edge of life, and a housekeeper who carried more humanity in her quiet presence than the rest of his empire combined. Morning crept slowly into the mansion, carrying with it a soft glow that slipped through the velvet curtains of Richard Harlow's room. The machines still hummed their mechanical lullaby, their beeps charting every fragile second of his existence. The doctors had grown weary, their faces lined with quiet defeat, yet they remained watching, recording, trying. Though their hands had already run out of miracles. Clara Williams stood at the edge of the room, her heart pounding. She had been there through the night, moving quietly, unnoticed, as the world's finest minds exhausted every option. Yet it wasn't medicine that weighed on her mind. It was the unbearable stillness of Richard's soul. She had always feared overstepping boundaries. For years she had lived in the shadow of wealth, careful to be invisible, careful not to break the unspoken wall between them and her. But now, as she looked at the frail man on the bed, the billionaire who once ruled empires, with a glance something inside her shifted. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her apron. She looked around. The family was absent, locked in another quarrel downstairs. The doctors, though present, were consumed by their instruments. No one would notice her. No one would stop her. A single thought burned in her heart. He cannot leave this world without knowing he mattered, not for his wealth, not for his power, but for being human. Taking a shaky breath, Clara stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath her shoes, each step heavier than the last. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, washing the room in a golden glow, soft and warm, a stark contrast to the cold sterility of the machines. It was as if the morning itself reached into the room, urging her forward. She reached his bedside and paused. Her throat tightened as she saw his hand, pale and limp against the crisp sheets. Slowly, as though approaching something sacred, she reached down and slipped her warm hand into his. His skin was cold, fragile, the pulse beneath faint but real. Clara leaned closer, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry the truth she needed him to hear. "You're not alone," she whispered, her words falling like a prayer into the golden air. "You're still human, and you're still loved." Tears stung her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she drew closer, her courage swelling from a place she didn't know she had. The boundary between servant and master, between wealth and poverty, between arrogance and humility, none of it mattered anymore. There was only life, fragile and fleeting. With a final breath of resolve, Clara leaned in and wrapped her arms gently around him. She pulled him close, careful not to disturb the wires, careful not to harm. It was not the embrace of an employee to her employer. It was the embrace of one human soul to another. The room seemed to hold its breath. Machines continued their steady. But in that embrace, there was something medicine could not measure: warmth, compassion, and a silent defiance against despair. And though Richard Harlow did not stir, though his eyes remained closed for the first time in years, perhaps, in his entire life, he was not alone. For a long, breathless moment, there was only silence. Clara held him, her arms trembling, her cheek pressed gently against the frail man who had once been untouchable. She whispered nothing more, only let her presence speak. Then, like the faintest ripple breaking the still surface of a lake, the monitor beeped differently. Subtle at first, a steadier rhythm, stronger than it had been in hours. Clara froze, uncertain if her mind was playing tricks. But then it came again. Beep. Stronger. Clearer. The doctors, who had been shuffling papers and murmuring hopelessly at the far side of the room, snapped their heads toward the sound. One of them nearly dropped his clipboard. "Wait, look at the monitor." Another leaned forward, eyes wide. "That can't be right." His heart rate, it's stabilizing. Clara pulled back slightly, her dark eyes darting between the doctors and Richard's pale face. For the first time in hours, his chest rose with a deeper, steadier breath. His lips, once ghostly white, began to take on a faint flush of pink. She gasped softly, her hand still holding his. "Oh my God!" She whispered, though she dared not move away. The room, once filled with the cold efficiency of medical jargon, erupted into disbelief. Doctors rushed to the machines, checking wires, recalibrating monitors, running fresh diagnostics as though desperate to explain the impossible. "His oxygen levels are climbing. Cardiac rhythm normalized. Look at that. This is not possible." They pressed stethoscopes to his chest, examined his pupils, ran through protocols as if trying to catch the glitch in reality. But there was none. Richard Harlow, the dying billionaire, whose body had defied 20 of the world's greatest doctors, was reviving not through injections or electric shocks, but through the warmth of a single embrace. Clara's breath hitched as she looked at him. A faint color brushed his cheeks, fragile but undeniable, like the first blush of dawn. His fingers twitched weakly in hers, a movement so small that anyone else might have missed it, but she felt it. She knew. Tears welled in her eyes. She tightened her grip, whispering again, this time through shaking lips. "You're not alone, Mr. Harlow. Do you hear me? You're not alone." The doctors exchanged looks of utter confusion, whispering among themselves. One muttered, "There's no medical explanation. Nothing we've done accounts for this." Another shook his head, whispering what they all thought but did not want to admit. It was her. The mansion seemed different in that instant. The golden sunlight, pouring through the curtains, bathed the room not in sterility, but in warmth. It was as if the house itself sighed, releasing the weight of despair it had carried for days. Clara, overwhelmed, could hardly believe what she was witnessing. She had no wealth, no education in medicine, no power. And yet, with nothing but the courage to love, she had done what the richest man's fortune and the brightest doctors could not. Richard Harlow was returning not to power, not to empire, but to life itself, and all it took was a hug. The air in the room felt transformed, lighter, warmer, alive. The doctors still hovered in disbelief around their monitors, whispering theories they could not reconcile with their training. Clara remained at Richard's side, her hand still cradling his, her heart hammering with both fear and wonder. And then, against all odds, his eyelids fluttered. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but then unmistakable. Richard Harlow, who hours ago had seemed lifeless, was opening his eyes. A murmur rippled through the room. The doctors leaned in, their voices low and urgent. Clara froze. She felt the weak twitch of his fingers tighten ever so slightly against her hand. Slowly, painfully, his pale lips parted. The room fell silent, every sound, the hum of the machines, the steady beeping, seeming to fade as his voice, rough and cracked, scraped its way out. Evelyn, her breath caught. She blinked, confused. He had rarely ever spoken her name, let alone with such softness. For years she had been invisible to him, a servant, a background figure. Yet now, in his frailest moment, her name was the first word he chose. Tears blurred her vision as she leaned closer. "I'm here, Mr. Harlow," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here." His eyes, dull with weakness, glistened faintly as though they were seeing not just her, but something far beyond the room. And in that fragile clarity, a memory surged from the depths of his guarded soul. He was no longer Richard Harlow, billionaire and titan of industry. He was a small boy again, hiding in the corner of a dim, creaking house. He remembered the smell of soap clinging to worn clothes, the soft lull of a voice that hummed to calm him. And most of all, he remembered the arms. Strong, brown, warm, wrapping around him when he was frightened. His mother's embrace. His mother, a black woman who scrubbed floors and carried trays to survive, who whispered to him that he was loved even when the world told them both they were nothing. He had loved her fiercely as a child, but as he grew, he buried her memory. He buried her under layers of pride, under palaces of marble, under the arrogance of wealth that made him deny where he came from. He had been ashamed of her hands, roughened by labor, ashamed of her plain dresses, ashamed of the very roots that had shaped him. And now, at the brink of death, it was that memory which surged back, dragged out of hiding, not by science, not by machines, but by Evelyn's embrace. The same warmth, the same strength, the same truth that he had run from all his life, that he was not just a billionaire, not just a name of power, but a human soul who longed to be loved. A tear slid down the corner of his eye, trembling on his skin like the weight of decades released. His lips trembled, and with the little breath he had, he whispered again, almost like a child calling out, "Mother." Clara's chest tightened. She squeezed his hand, whispering back, "You're not alone, Richard. Not now, not ever." And in that moment, the mansion's walls, the fortune, the arguments raging downstairs, all of it vanished into irrelevance. What remained was a man, rediscovering the part of himself he had denied, the part that needed love more than wealth, the part that only a simple hug could awaken. Days turned into weeks, and against every prediction the doctors had made, Richard Harlow's strength began to return. His recovery was slow, uneven, marked by fragile steps and long silences, but it was happening. What baffled the doctors most was not just his survival, but the change in the man himself, for Richard was no longer the cold, untouchable figure he had been. Something had shifted inside him the moment Evelyn's arms wrapped around him, as though her embrace had not only steadied his failing heart, but unlocked the humanity he had long buried. The first sign came in something small, something no one in the mansion had seen in decades: a smile. It was not the polished grin he used for photographs or the tight smirk he gave in boardrooms. It was soft, unguarded, almost boyish. The kind of smile that warmed a room instead of commanding it. Evelyn noticed it first when she brought him a glass of water one afternoon. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle, not dismissive, not clipped, genuine. She nearly dropped the glass. In all her years of service, Richard Harlow had never spoken her name with that kind of warmth. She nodded, blinking back the sudden sting of tears, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile back. From that day forward, the change became undeniable. Richard no longer barked orders at the staff. He asked. He listened. Sometimes, he even laughed, an unfamiliar sound that echoed down the halls like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. The mansion, once a shrine to wealth and arrogance, began to feel alive. The chandeliers no longer glared coldly, but shimmered with warmth. As music returned to the hall's soft jazz, Evelyn hummed while cleaning, which Richard now asked her not to stop. The grand dining table, once a place of solitary meals, became a shared space where staff were invited to sit with him. At first they hesitated, unused to the idea. But Richard insisted, and slowly, cautiously, the walls of hierarchy softened. Most astonishing of all was how he treated Evelyn. No longer the help, she became something more, his confidant, his anchor, the family he had been too proud to acknowledge. He spoke with her about his childhood, about the mother he had hidden in the shadows of his memory. Evelyn listened, her eyes kind, her silence more comforting than words. "You remind me of her," he admitted one evening, his voice breaking. "For so long, I tried to forget where I came from. I thought money would erase it. But now, I see it was the only part of me worth keeping." Evelyn placed her hand over his, her eyes shining. "You've always been human, Mr. Harlow. You just needed to remember." For the first time in decades, Richard Harlow did not feel alone. The emptiness that had haunted his mansion, the greed that once poisoned its air, was replaced by something wealth could never buy: compassion. And in the golden light of each new afternoon, the once feared billionaire sat with the housekeeper by his side, not as master and servant, but as family. The sun dipped low beyond the horizon, casting the Harlow mansion in hues of gold and rose. Once, its marble walls and glittering chandeliers had symbolized wealth beyond imagination, yet within had lingered only emptiness. Now, for the first time in decades, the house felt alive, filled not with arrogance, but with warmth. Richard Harlow sat near the tall windows of his study, wrapped in a blanket, his body thinner but his spirit unrecognizably lighter. Evelyn sat across from him, mending a small tear in one of his sweaters. The sight would have been unthinkable just weeks before: a billionaire and his housekeeper, sharing the same silence, the same peace. But the mansion no longer obeyed the laws of pride and distance. It had shifted, transformed by something far more powerful than money or science. Richard's thoughts wandered as he looked out into the fading light. His mind returned to the sterile chaos of that afternoon, the beeping monitors, the urgent voices of the finest doctors in the world, the machines that had cost more than most families would earn in a lifetime. All of them had failed to steady his failing body. And then, Evelyn's arms, a simple embrace. No degrees, no wealth, no technology, just human touch. It humbled him to realize that what saved him was not what he had spent his life worshiping: power, wealth, dominance. It was something he had overlooked for decades, something he had dismissed as weakness: kindness, love, humanity. The lesson sank deep, heavier than any contract he had ever signed. deeper than any empire he had ever built. He saw his life stretched. Behind him, a trail of triumphs and conquests, but also broken relationships, silenced laughter, and a heart locked in pride. He realized now that the true poverty he had suffered was not the absence of money, but the absence of connection. As Evelyn placed a mended sweater neatly beside him, Richard spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. All my life, I thought strength was measured by what I could buy, by how many people bowed to me. But in the end, it was a single act of kindness that saved me. One hug from someone I never truly saw until it was almost too late. Evelyn looked at him with quiet eyes, her expression calm, her presence steady. She didn't need to respond with words. The truth was already written in the rhythm of the room, in the way silence now felt safe rather than empty. The moral of Richard's story was clear, as undeniable as the heartbeat that still pulsed in his chest. True healing doesn't always come from money, status, or even science. Sometimes it comes from love, humanity, and the courage to care. The once feared billionaire now understood what the world's greatest powers could not teach him, that a single act of kindness can break through arrogance, silence despair, and even turn back the shadow of death. And so, in the twilight of his life, Richard Harlow finally discovered the treasure he had been chasing all along: not wealth, not dominance, but the simple, extraordinary power of being human.